Hello everyone, welcome to my workshop. Today I'm going to be making some cutting boards, specifically this 3D weave pattern cutting board. My choice of woods for this build will be walnut, padauk, and maple. I'll start with the square portions. I'm going to need 15 of these squares, 5 of the padauk maple, 3 of the walnut maple, and 1 fully maple square per board. I'll be making 3 boards. This is a strip I'll be making to cut my squares from. All my lumber is 4x4 and has been sitting for a while, so it's become a bit warped. Because of that, I'll cut 8-inch pieces of all the boards. This will reduce the amount of waste created when I plane them, and it'll make for an easier glue up. I'm shooting for just under 1.5-inch cubes, so 8 inches of length will give me about 5 cubes per strip, with about ½ inch of waste after accounting for the kerf. The padauk is a bit undersized for the dimensions that I chose, so one of the boards will end up being a bit smaller than the rest. If you'd like to follow along, make sure all your boards are at least 5 inches wide and you won't have this problem. To flatten the boards, I'll use my CNC since I don't have a planer. A CNC isn't required for this project as long as you have a planer, but you will need something like a drum sander to flatten end grain later on. I'm marking the center for my origin. My machine will cut in this direction, so I arranged my board so that the grain direction follows. After spending way too much time on that, I'll clean up the edges. I bought my lumber straight line ripped on one edge so I can run it through the table saw. To create the pattern, I'll draw a line on the end of the board at 1.5 inches, and then another line at 45 degrees from that line. There's a faster way to do this without changing the setup each time, but due to the dimensions of the boards I have, I'd be pretty close to not having enough material if I did it that way. My method is to cut one piece, then use that edge as the angled side of the next piece. The downside of this is that you have to move the fence and change the blade angle every time. Oh, by the way, I'm not showing it, but I'm cutting all the pieces I showed earlier simultaneously except for one of the maple. I need to save one of those because it's going to be a different shape. For some reason I got these burn marks on almost all my padauk pieces on the 45 side. I've worked with this material before and I knew that there would be tooling marks if I made an angled cut like that. So I'll run them again, removing only the smallest bit of material, just to get rid of the marks. With the angled pieces done, I'll cut 14 maple pieces at 3/4 of an inch. I'll turn each piece 90 degrees and run them again to get perfectly square pieces. These will be the corner pieces of my larger square strips. In order for all the sides to line up, they have to all be the same thickness. I'm leaving the saw set at 3/4 of an inch and I'm running this side through it. I struggled to find a safe way to do this, but I ended up using a piece of scrap with a straight edge to push against the fence, and I'm using that to push my pieces through. I'm also using another piece to maintain pressure against the fence. This cutting board has a lot of parts to it, so I find it helpful to lay out all the pieces and make sure I actually cut enough of them. This maple with nothing on it will be used to make the top right corner squares, so it'll be glued to itself later on. To help with the glue up, I made these simple little 3D printed clamp things. The glue up is still pretty awkward though. I have to balance the first 2 clamps on this side with a little bit of pressure. Too much pressure before the other clamps are on will cause them to collapse. I wiggle the clamps as I'm applying pressure so that they sit evenly against the 3D printed parts. Once they're all on, I tighten all the clamps and they self-center. This is actually my second attempt at this type of cutting board and these help tremendously. My initial attempt resulted in gaps and misalignments, and I had to do a ton of work to salvage what was usable. I'm actually writing this script before I even cut the squares, so we'll see if my solution even works. These are made from Polymaker's Polylite PLA Pro and are super easy to remove from the wood glue. I don't have 100 clamps, so I'm going to let them sit in the clamps for 10 minutes, wrap them in tape, and let them sit overnight. I completely forgot to wipe off the excess glue and that's going to be a problem later on. While those cure, I'm going to get started on the rectangular portions. This will be a padauk, walnut, and maple sandwich, I guess. I'll make these 10 inches long so that each portion yields about 6 little pieces. I'll need about 19 pieces per board. I say about 19 because it would be wise to make a few extras. I'm going to resaw some of the padauk and walnut. I want 1/4 inch pieces of padauk and 1/2 inch pieces of walnut. I know I said earlier that I was making 3 boards, but because some of the pieces actually fell short, I'm going to be making the third one separately off camera to avoid confusion since it'll require different dimensions. I've marked some of the pieces with an X to let me know that those faces haven't been planed yet, so I'll use the other side as my glue surface. I'm going to scrape off most of the glue from the edges. I'm not trying to make it perfect, this is just so that the glue bits don't go flying and hit me in the face later when I cut it. Since I left the walnut longer than it needed to be, I'm going to use that edge against the fence. This board had one straight edge. If I actually remembered to do it, I should have left that edge out on the overhanging side. I'll cut the other side off and set it apart for now. Switching back over to the square pieces, here's where the glue from earlier becomes a problem. I want to use this side against the fence, so I'll have to scrape all the glue off of all these pieces. I'll use a chisel to try to make these as flat as possible, and I'll have to do this for every piece. To square up these pieces, after every cut I make, I'll flip the piece 90 degrees and cut the other side. It's important to make these cuts in pairs because if you cut one side with the square on it and one side with the miter on it, the miters won't line up and the square will be a rectangle. With those sides flat, I can safely do the other two sides now. Same thing as before, cut and flip. Now that all those pieces are square and the same size, I can finally cut them into smaller pieces. I'll do this by using a stop block. These don't have to be exactly the same size since this will be the height of the cutting board and that's going to get surfaced later on anyways. In order for this to work, the sandwich pieces have to be exactly 3 squares tall and 1 square in thickness. This actually is really important. If these deviate too much, there's going to be huge gaps in the cutting board. I'll get pretty close by setting the fence using 3 pieces and backing off a little bit. Then I'll nudge it slightly after every cut and check if they're the right size yet. That looks good enough to me. Quick aside here, I was playing around with these pieces to see if I can find cool patterns I could use for future cutting boards, and I realized you could just make a framed cube like this instead of that first awkward glue up from earlier. It might be easier this way if you're making a lot of them. To get these to the right thickness, I made this jig. You can also just pass the pieces like you normally would against the fence, but I was having issues with the pieces drifting into the blade. This could probably be avoided by using something like the micro jig gripper, since this issue is most likely caused by my push stick having inadequate pressure with the front of the pieces. I'll cut a few of these to make the end pieces of the board. These will be the same size as the squares. I was hoping I could just pour glue into a container and dip pieces into it, but it was making a huge mess. On top of that, this cheap wood roller from Amazon wasn't even rolling. It was just kind of gliding across the surface. I also started to forget which sides actually needed glue. I'll just clamp what I already have and hopefully I can think of a way to fix it. I'll just set it aside for now. Change of plans for board number 2. I'm going to glue these pieces together first to make the final glue up more manageable. These are some pieces of aluminum flat bar that I had lying around, and I'm hoping this will keep the pieces aligned. Once this is glued, I won't be able to remove material from those sides, so hopefully they stay flush. I'll carefully scrape the glue off to create a proper mating surface for the glue. A table saw should not be used here because cutting any further than flush will throw off the entire board. After double checking that everything is oriented correctly, I'm ready to try this glue up again, and luckily it went a lot better this time. I noticed a gap on one of these cubes and I'm going to try to stuff it with glue and hopefully it isn't noticeable. Okay, back to the other board. This piece is wrong. Let's remove it. I'll start by removing the protruding piece. Since there's no way to preserve the illusion on this edge anymore, my plan is to put a long strip of walnut here and hopefully it looks intentional and not like a band-aid. I'll use some tape to hold the pieces together while they glue. The strength of this joint doesn't matter because I'll be gluing this in the middle of the board, so a butt joint is fine. I'll cut the edges first on the bandsaw because I can be more precise. And I'll remove the bulk of the cube on the table saw. I had a couple of extra cubes that were too big, and I'll use the same jig from earlier to cut them down to size. After many attempts, I got the square to fit snug, and now I can glue it in. Once that's dry, I can prepare the 2 edges for glue. The piece of walnut will sit here, so I have to cut both sides to make them flat. With the glue applied, I'll try to align these as accurately as possible. There's no good reference edges, so I'm just going to do this by eye. Back on the other board. To get a clean edge, I attached the level to the board using double-sided tape, then cleaned up the rest of the edges. In order for this to work, the edges already have to be mostly flat. Otherwise, you can use like a jointing jig. Now that the edges are square and flat, I want to make a border around the cutting board. I'm going to use maple for this. Nothing too fancy here. I just made some strips and I'm going to attach them with butt joints. Again, the strength isn't an issue here because the sides are going to be glued on too. After I glue on 3 edges, I'm going to cut the excess off of one edge. Then I'll attach the final side. I'm going to use the CNC again to plane the cutting board. I don't really know of another way to do this other than a router planing jig or a drum sander. I don't know much about planers, but I've heard that you should not run end grain through them. Something about the wood exploding or something. But do your own research. There's videos here on YouTube about how you might be able to do that safely. But since I don't do it that way, I can't really offer any suggestions. Okay, we're almost done. I just need to clean up the edges and do some sanding. I'm going to sand with 80 and 120 grit sandpaper. In my opinion, that should be a smooth enough surface. I'm going to put a 16th inch roundover on all the top edges. I'm also going to add little rubber feet to these, and I want them to be symmetric, so I'll mark where I want them to go. I'll put them about 3/4 of an inch from the edge. I really wanted to make custom wooden feet for these, but with my deadline approaching quickly, I knew I wouldn't have enough time to do that. I'll spray some water onto the boards to raise the grain and wait about 15 minutes, then do another sanding with 120 grit. And finally some mineral oil to finish off these boards. Some people like to fully soak their cutting boards overnight to let the wood fully absorb the oil, but I think this is good enough. And I also don't have enough oil for that. The Padauk ended up a bit darker than I expected, and it kind of blends into the walnut in some areas. It's not quite the contrast I wanted, but I still think it looks pretty good. And I also think it'll age very nicely. And there you have it. Now let's do a price breakdown. These prices are from Woodworker's source and are accurate at the time of recording. All lumber is 4/4 nominal thickness. Premium black walnut is $17.99 per board foot. I used about 3/4 of a board foot. You could opt for a lower grade of walnut, but I think it's important to consider that you might produce more waste and spend more time working around imperfections. You'd only save about $4, and it's really not worth doing at this scale. Padauk is $15.99 and I only used about half a board foot. Maple is $7.99 and I used 1.75 board feet. I don't want to seem like I'm overinflating the cost, but I'm going to include the price of shipping here because unless you live close to a lumber mill, there's no way around this. Even if you buy packs with free shipping, if you do the math, you'll see that the price per board foot is usually around double what you would pay otherwise. So shipping is factored in already. And for the small consumables, I used about half a bottle of Type Bond 3 and not very much mineral oil. Let's just say $7 total for that. That brings the cost of the material to around $67.50 plus taxes per cutting board. If you're selling these, you'll have to factor in your labor cost. I live in California, and let's just say that I pay myself minimum wage. If I got pretty good at making these, I'm confident I could make a single board with 6 hours of actual labor. That brings the cost total per board to $166.50. If I made more boards at the same time, I think each additional board will take about 2 hours. Here's how that would scale. But what do you think? Is this too much for a 12x18 cutting board? Either way, I'm happy with how these turned out. And here's a part list in case anybody needs it. Thank you for watching.